we're comparing our first drafts to like published drafts, not being afraid to rip your story apart and put it back together. Hey, it's Lily. I'm an aspiring author. I'm currently editing the third draft of my work in progress, and I'm here to share the journey because I'm doing everything for the first time and we're learning together. I just wanted to make a video about editing a book because this was a huge part in my journey that was the most challenging for me this far. I wish I had a video like this that would just talk about how I edit a book, how people edit, what someone's editing process looks like. By sharing my experience editing, I am no way saying that this is correct or this is the only way to do it. I'm just saying that this is what is working for me intuitively. I am not a professional. I am not a published author yet. Everything I say is either something I've learned from personal experience or I've read about in a craft book, or I've learned from just like interacting in the writing community. I've edited two full drafts and now I'm editing a third draft. So I do have some experience with editing with self edits. I think editing is something that can be really uncomfortable for people because there's not like a clear trajectory of where your path is leading you. And there's no like straight up guideline of how you should edit your story because the only person that's going to know what's best for your story is you. The biggest thing that I've learned in the editing process is how to trust myself with my own edits because I think a lot of times if I'm second guessing everything, it gets really complicated because editing is something that you can always change art. Art is so subjective, and like any other type of art, writing is extremely subjective. So if you are constantly going back and forth between what you're going to do, how you're going to change a scene, how you're going to change this character, there's an infinite amount of possibilities for your story. And I think that's what's so overwhelming with editing because every time you read it, you could find something else that you want to change. And that's normal. And I think leaning into that process instead of fixating on making everything perfect has helped me a lot. Editing is something that has always been really daunting. And when I first finished my first draft, you have that high of like, wow, I finally did it. This is the moment. I did the fun thing where I printed out my manuscript, I got highlighters, I got the red pen, and I just went through and read it and marked it up. And I had all these comments and all these highlights and everything. And I was like, perfect. Like, I edited it. And then I was sat there with a manuscript that was all marked up, but now I have to actually change it. And I think implementing edits is the part that is really complicated for me because there's so much nuance and there's so much possibility that you're like, oh, I could change this sentence or I could change this paragraph or this character or this name. And you can really like drive yourself crazy with the possibility of edits. It's an inverted triangle where you want to start with the biggest possible changes and narrow it down to the smallest changes. So think of like the changes that would require rewriting the entire book. Changes that would completely derail your plot, completely change characters, completely change massive parts of your story. These are the things you want to edit first. And it can be really annoying because you're going through and you're like, oh, I don't like this sentence. I don't like this character. I don't like this element of the story, or this scene is weird. This is kind of like the developmental stage where you're looking for plot and character and arcs and world building and kind of like the overall structure of the story. I think this part is actually pretty fun, I would say, because there's still not a lot of pressure. Like you're not looking at the line level yet. So I think you can still have a lot of ideas. I really like to focus on character because I think character really drives the story, especially because I really want to write character driven stories. The complexities of characters is what's really fascinating to me about stories. So I want to make sure that all my characters' arcs intertwine in the correct way. And I also want to make sure that all my characters are fleshed out completely. So when I go through, I edit a lot for character, which kind of comes up in like character voice, character motivation, character flaws, their misbeliefs, their beliefs, their journey, their arc. I kind of look at like the big picture of everything. I'll go through and I'll kind of like highlight like where I think a character needs to be expanded, where a character needs more life to them. Another thing that I really focus on in the developmental stage is the world. So I think about the world building. For me, I'm writing a fantasy, so this is a lot more complicated. But I think more about like the map of the world, the different kingdoms, the different cultures, the different languages, the different nuances. I think about the magic system. And for me, my magic system in my book is extremely intertwined with the world itself. So I can't even create the world without the magic system first. So I really take time focusing on the world building in itself. And I look at areas in my story where I can really expand this and I can really make sure that it is making sense fully, because I think with a magic system, there are many possibilities for plot holes. And this is something that I think I'm trying to work on, because I will kind of like, even now to this point where I'm going through for the third time, I'm still fixing major plot holes through the magic system, because when you introduce magic, I feel like it makes plots more complicated and it makes it harder to believe what is happening in the plot. I want to make sure that my plot doesn't seem convenient. After like the character, the world building, I really like to focus on pacing, and this is really helpful when you kind of plot your story first. But I think pacing is really important to look for in edits, especially developmental edits. This is what drives your story forward. I've heard pacing be described in many different ways, so I want to go through it. The first way I've heard people talk about it is it's like different cycles, different arcs in your story, where pacing is the completion and the satisfaction of different mini arcs that lead to bigger arcs that lead to the full arc of the story. So it keeps you interested and engaged and invested in the story as it's going on and as it's building on itself over time. So think about a chapter as like you have like three scenes in the chapter, and the chapter itself is an arc. So you want to think of like how this chapter is going to feel fully together, and it almost feels like its own mini story within the bigger story. And then each act is going to be its own mini story within the bigger story. And the way I would talk about this is like each story has its own mini climax and its own conflict that is being resolved or being not resolved. And that's helped me a lot, especially through editing, where I've noticed certain chapters there's nothing really going on in that chapter. It almost feels more of a filler. So, in my editing stage, in the developmental stage, I will go through and look at each chapter and be like, does this feel like a completed arc? Does it feel like we're moving the story forward? Does it feel like there's a conflict? Do I feel invested? Another way that I've seen pacing being described is pacing is the balance of a story. So, if you're writing a certain genre, there's certain like genre expectations. So, for example, I'm writing a fantasy romance, so there is expectations for fantasy and romance. And I think pacing can be off when people are expecting something and they're not getting that, whether that's like there's not enough romance, the romance is taking too long, there's not enough fantasy, the plot isn't developed enough. Also, on more of a line level, you want to have a balance of exposition, dialogue, prose, inner monologue, kind of the whole thing. Like you want to make it sure that it's kind of rhythmically balanced. That also helps with pacing on a smaller level, because if you have like a giant paragraph of like world building, that's going to be overwhelming to the reader and feel slow and dragged on. But if you have a really big action scene where you have like punchy dialogue with like very minimal tags, that's going to feel really fast. So I think a lot of it is like the style of how you do your edits. And this is also more into like the line level. Pacing is something that comes up in developmental edits, line edits, pretty much every level of editing that I've come across. When I'm done with the first draft and I kind of make these big developmental edits, I think rewriting your book is really helpful, because going through and trying to change every line to make it the new story can be really complicated and overwhelming. I'll have the original story on one side, and then I'll have the new story, the blank story on the other side, and I'll just rewrite it, and I end up loving the story twice, three times as more every single time. And for me, I actually find it quicker to rewrite rather than go through and tediously change every line. But that's also just a stylistic preference for me. Once I'm done with like developmental edits, I'll move on to more line level edits. And even when I'm on line level edits, I'm still looking at developmental issues because they're all very intertwined. I've been really focusing on character voice and making sure that my tone and my dialogue is natural. As a reader, that's one of the things that I'm most picky about, is it takes me out of the story really fast when the dialogue feels fabricated or artificial or not real. I've heard a lot of things about dialogue where dialogue needs to feel real, but it also can't just be realistic, because it also needs to be entertaining and driving the plot forward. So like finding that balance of making the dialogue realistic but also driving the plot forward and being entertaining is something that's I've been trying to craft better with setting and exposition. I like to add more finite details. I heard this thing with world building where it really helps where instead of going very wide with your world building, you want to go very deep with your world building. So like instead of naming all the kingdoms in the world, you go really deep into like one or two kingdoms. And that's makes your world feel so much more real because that's gonna be what matters. If I have a scene, instead of saying like I'm in a room with like a door and a window, I'll say I'm in a room with a very particular smell. And I feel like that makes it a lot more unique. Instead of describing like 10 different things about the room, I could just describe one or two really finite details about the room, and then it makes it feel more real. I'm kind of starting line level edits. I haven't gotten too deep into line level, but I like to just reread my chapter. I like to go chapter by chapter because it makes the editing feel less daunting. As I'm reading the chapter, I will just change things as I go. This is something that I do on the third drafts. I think just rereading my story over and over again, I catch different things and I have like a mental log of all the changes that I've made. So if I'm reading something that isn't congruent with something that I changed earlier, I will match it and make it more consistent. Something that is really important for editing and that has helped me is trusting my intuition. It's easy to overthink every edit you make. And I used to be really scared of deleting writing because I was like, oh my gosh, like if I just delete this chapter, like it's gone. Like, what if I made a mistake? What if it was actually really good? At least at this point, I've spent so much time with my story that if I delete a chapter, I know the characters, I know the plot, I know the story. I can just rewrite a chapter that's going to be a million times better. And I think a lot of that comes from trusting my intuition. If I feel like something isn't working, I'll change it. If I feel like a sentence sounds beautiful and I like the way it sounds, I won't focus too hard whether it's grammatically correct or whether it technically makes sense. I just kind of roll with it. Making those split decisions in editing is really helpful because if I sit down and I think too hard about every single detail, it will quickly overwhelm me. A lot of times I like to read my work out loud because it helps me like think of the flow of the story. And if I notice something that like gets my attention, I'll just change it like intuitively to what I think it should be at that moment and then I move on because if I wait until everything is absolutely perfect, I will just be driving myself crazy. I have to trust future me to fix it. My draft will never be perfect. Even when I publish this book, it will never be perfect. There's always something you can change and there's always going to be something that you will not think is good enough. And I think just working at it and working at it and just keep going every single time I have noticed drastic improvements from my draft 1 to draft 3, but it's one of those things that if I was so focused on draft 1 and I was so focused on all the details, I wouldn't even get to draft 3 because I would be too overwhelmed and it'd burn myself out. I like to give myself kind of like a rough time limit for each chapter that I'm editing. In this round of edits, I'm trying to edit one chapter a day. And at first, I wanted to do two chapters or I'll take longer for one chapter, but I think giving myself a rough guideline helps me move forward when I'm stuck. I just have to accept that it won't be perfect and move on to the next chapter because I can always come back and fix it. But if I dwell on it too much, it's going to prevent me from moving on with the story. And I might even not need that chapter in the future because I might end up changing the plot anyways. Editing is such a complex journey. It's not one size fits all. Imposter syndrome is massive in the writing community just because writing is something that is so subjective and it is so personal. I'm learning everything as I go. I'm learning all of these editing tricks and these editing things from experience, through trial and error, through seeing what other people are doing and then learning about it. I do plan on getting professional editing. If I have one piece of advice for editing, I would say do lots of trial and error and then with your intuition decide what's working for you and what's not and then going with what feels right. Not thinking too much, not worrying too much about perfectionism because that can be really hard. It's less me giving advice and it's more me like sharing what has been working for me and what my experience is. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it and happy writing.